Hello, welcome to EDFGC 5809. This week we're looking at both the action research cycle in respect to the look, think, act steps, which I think will hopefully inform you or be quite helpful in respect to you collecting some artifacts and reflecting on your practice, whether you're out on placement now or whether you're doing that later. And also examining some key selection criteria and unpack the STAR approach, which I mentioned in the chat, and it sounded like that would be quite a helpful thing to move forward rather than doing week 10, so that's what I've decided to do. This week's learning intention is for you to recognise the range and depth of professional dimensions in respect to teachers' work, which is actually the same thing you pretty much have had all throughout this course, and also prepare to articulate your personal beliefs, values, commitments and identities as a professional as a professional educator, and demonstrate these through documented evidence. And that's where the action research cycle is probably quite helpful as you're generating evidence of your impact. Your success criteria is that you should be able to identify and actually put forward some professional considerations that you will include in your positioning statement and that you will demonstrate evidence of in your portfolio, and both those are part of your second assessment. Sorry, it should be assessment 3, not second assessment. Anyway, so action research. Some of you are probably fairly familiar with that concept, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but it's a form of research that is strongly associated with what practitioners do, so what teachers do, and it's a way for people to work collaboratively. Action research as a whole is actually a very democratic process, which is connecting with the idea of shared learning. You often do this in learning teams or as a whole school. So it's not necessarily led by a researcher, but if we're looking at it as an aspect or as a form of practitioner research, it obviously informs the practitioner, i.e. you. So it's a strategy for learning that's more about the teaching and learning process, which is why it's a really good fit with what we do, both in respect to whole schools and as with what we do as teachers. And it's a matter of teachers deciding what is actually relevant for them and what's relevant to examine in order for them to gain insight about what's happening in their classroom, which is what you're doing, whether you're putting forward examples of what you're doing as a teacher in respect to selection criteria for a job, or whether you're looking at generating evidence for your portfolio, whatever it is. I mean, we learn through reflection, as we've said a number of times in this course. So rather than deciding on a lot of different aspects of our practice, we're trying to keep a fairly sharp focus, because we gain better insight if we actually concentrate on a few things, one thing maybe. Doesn't mean that other things aren't important, it just means that we're putting things in focus. We audit the current situation, so we actually take stock of what's happening. And we do that by looking at what goes on, collecting evidence, and we analyse and interpret that, which then informs how we plan action, what we decide to do before we take action, and then we evaluate that and collect evidence on to what degree that has happened. And in fact, sorry, my computer is making a noise when it receives an email, but I don't think you can hear it. Never mind. It's an action research cycle, so it's not just one loop. This continues on as a spiral, just like life, really. We concentrate on one thing, we reflect on it, we determine a plan of action, we implement that, and then the new things progressing. So that's how it goes. And it is based on the belief that teachers have the ability to formulate really valid questions about their practice and pursue objective answers to scrutinise that and find answers that are meaningful in the context. So they're not sort of universal truths. There are ways forward and evidence that relate to what actually goes on. And in respect to your focus, it's in respect to your own role as a teacher and what you do as a teacher. And that's also where the idea of your values and all your considerations that are actually part of this rather broad course, you concentrate on a few of those in respect to you generating evidence. And it makes sense that you actually start collecting evidence in respect to the success criteria, which is why I've put up some examples of advertisements so that you got something to hang it up on, because the idea of this whole assessment task and this whole course is for you to really become teaching ready. So I don't want you to think of it as an academic exercise. Take this as an opportunity to really prepare yourself for employment and for jobs. So you can find your own advertisements if you want, or if you want to use the ones I've put up on Moodle, you can. But I would suggest that that might give you quite a good focus when you look at key criteria that you would examine and generate evidence from. So action research assists teachers to become more reflective practitioners and also more systematic in how we go about solving problems, and methodical is the word I'm looking for, in respect to how we go about it. And this is taken from the Victorian Education website. Okay, so as I said, I think a really helpful way of your plan of attack, if you like, in respect to this, is to actually hang it up on advertisements. I'm going to share one advertisement with you that's not uploaded on Moodle because I'm using an old example, but you've got other ones there. So to begin with, when you see an advertisement, and I'm sure you do this all the time, when you see an advertisement, is that you actually try to analyze it, you deconstruct it, and you think, well, what are they actually asking me? What's inferred meanings and what's in between the lines, for example? If it talks about an experienced and dedicated staff member or an enthusiastic member of staff, they're different connotations and they're different experiences, really, and skills and possibly values as well, connected with those words. So you actually need to pay really careful attention to what's in there. And sometimes it's quite helpful to get another perspective, to ask people what they interpret that to be, to see it from another view. It's also very good to get some background information. So you obviously know the school that is advertising for a member of staff. So you want to get an understanding of your audience, really. You want to get an understanding of what that school is like. So do a bit of legwork around it. Go on the school's website, for example. Look at the My School data for the school, because that will give you some understanding of possibly what the reality is like at that school. What are some of the things that you might interpret that they're grappling with or prioritising? So you will come away with some impressions. Even looking at where it's located using Google Maps, for example, might be quite helpful. Some of these notes are kind of developed, or some of these slides are kind of developed with a mindset of you applying for a job or applying or getting an interview with a job. So it's going to be a bit of a generic thing. And I've decided to keep even the interview aspects in there because I think, you're going to get there eventually. And even if it's not strictly relevant for this course, I think it is relevant for life. When we're looking at action research, then you think in respect to a personal component of that, it's looking at your own classroom practice, your teaching and learning, which obviously you can relate to an ad. And if we're looking at school teams, we're looking at collective practice, teaching, learning, and that's where that democratic principle comes in respect to action research. And basically, it's a cycle of 3 steps, and even though it kind of looks like 4 steps here, it's because I wanted it to start with a what, because that's the first step. We actually look at what is presented before us in respect to our focus. So in respect to whether we're looking at key selection criteria in an ad, and we're looking at what's happening, what am I doing in respect to that, or whether you're looking at maybe in relation to the EITSL standards, the teaching standards, and you hang it up on a standard. Consider, okay, what are you doing? Have a look at your practice first. Then you think, so you actually analyze aspects of that practice. That's the so what step, if you like. And then you start planning on how you would improve, what's going to be the next step, almost like a formative assessment aspect, before you start implementing whatever it is you're doing that you then, later on, this is why it's a cycle, think, okay, so how did that work? You evaluated what happened, and interpret and keep going and going. And what's going to be the next step? This is a really good fit with the idea of highly effective professional learning, and you have a hyperlink there to quite a good little document from the Education Department in Victoria. A lot of these principles actually are very good drivers for action research. And even if you don't think, oh, I'm going to be an action researcher, think of it as in respect to you scrutinizing and examining, analysing and reflecting on your practice. And there's some clear links here, obviously. So first of all, the first principle is that it is very much focused on improving student learning outcomes. That doesn't mean that we necessarily think, well, we think about the teaching associated, but our main focus is on the students' learning. So sometimes that actually requires us to rather think, oh, what would I do? Think, okay, well, how will I see that what I do actually connects with the students? How is that improving their learning? Where is the student at before that informs your practice? So really, I mean, if you look at what we talked about a few weeks ago, keeping learning on track every minute, every day, it's the same thing. It's the same thinking that constantly connects with these ideas. It's focused on embedded in teaching practice. So it's really not just something we sprout, but something we really do. And again, that's why we need to look at what we do, examine that evidence, analyse it before we decide on how we can improve it further. It is research informed. So that's why we're looking at things like effect sizes, research that informs us what really has an impact. And I'm not just talking about visible learning in Hattie. There's a lot of research that connects to practice, but that we're actually using those vehicles, using insights from research to inform us. And certainly when we're examining our practice, we're related to what we come across in research. When you're explaining and justifying your choices, you probably do connect it to some of the things that inform you as a teacher. And that should be research driven, really. It's also very collaborative, not just you on your own reflecting and deciding on where to go next, but that we work in teams. I've tried to, despite all the hurdles with the blogs, this subject has been designed to kind of help you actually collaborate, even though you're distance students, to facilitate that, because that's what we do as teachers. That's modern teaching, modern classroom practice. Whether we physically see each other or whether we're a part of a big wider network that we collaborate with. We use evidence and data to guide our improvement and measure impact. And that's actually, even though it might sound quite ambitious and perhaps a little bit scary, it's actually what you're doing when you're collecting artifacts for your portfolio. It's what you're doing when you're annotating a photo of a poster that a student developed as part of a unit. If you're connecting that with what your learning intention was, what kind of learning outcomes, and how that the students meeting those learning outcomes is manifested in that sample, that's what you do. You're generating evidence. You're actually collecting data. And from there, you will identify aspects that you can think, okay, well, what did I do? What was my role in that? That was your impact. What you can do like a before and after if you're doing a unit of work. And this might be things that you haven't necessarily done yet, but you need to get into that habit of actually evaluating and looking at the impact your teaching has as part of what you do as a teacher. It's what you need to explain how you're going about measuring your impact, for example, when you're applying for a job. So that's where this fits in. And you could even use that as a reference when you're explaining your approach. You might have a look at this document that you've got a hyperlink to there. It's ongoing and it's supported and it's integrated into the culture within the school. So that if you don't really have a school that you're operating in or a system that you're operating in, that's something that you're then looking at maybe how you would be part of that system with the schools. That's knowing your school is going to be quite helpful in that respect. It's both you as an individual having responsibility for this, but you're a cog, if you like, in a wheel, in a collective wheel. So there's a collective responsibility as well for making sure that we have highly effective professional learning. So some ways of making this happen, if you like, this professional learning might be action research. It might be, and part of that action research could be to examine student work. It's certainly a way for you to generate evidence for your portfolio in the form of artifacts. It might be study groups, whether they are part of a formal study group, like you being enrolled at uni and possibly doing some further training later on, or whether it's a more informal study group where you get together. You might have like a little study book club almost at a school, possible. Case discussions where you actually examine, this might be part of moderation of assignments, for example, or before reports are due to have input. It can be just those professional conversations we have that we spoke about a few weeks ago as well, that Timperley is talking about, can be a connection with that. Observing each other and learning from each other. So peer observation. We talked about critical friends. It's a similar idea. And lesson studies can certainly be part of that as well. There's some action research projects that the department have been quite involved in. One is the Science and School Research Project. I don't know all that much about it, but you might be more familiar. Anyway, it's an example of an ongoing, I think, research project. School Innovation in Teaching and the Principle of Learning and Teaching, or the POLT, which will probably give you, again, some good little hooks, if you like, in respect to hanging up your teaching, hanging up your reflection, examining student learning, that I would suggest will be probably quite helpful when you develop your position statement and portfolio as well. And certainly when you apply for jobs, all those things just might give you, if they resonate with you and you think, yeah, it gives you something to put forward that you're doing. Another reference framework is the 5E model, which I spoke about last week. That again will give you something to frame your high impact and professional learning and professional teaching on. Okay, so where is this going then? As I said, a lot of these are aspects that you're going to be touching on in the third assessment. And even though there's a separate recording of me unpacking the third assessment, I just thought a little refresher, a little reminder might be helpful. In part 3A, you're going to put forward a personal teaching positioning statement. I know it's a bit cumbersome the way that's worded, but anyway. And you're also going to put forward some professional portfolio contributions, which are really preparing you for employment. So your positioning statement should be, that's where you kind of explain who you are as a teacher, what you see yourself, and that's part of your teaching philosophy, which we've spoken about. That's about 1,000 of your words that you're using for that. Look at the more details. I'm just giving you the headlines here, if you like. You're also going to include a teaching position advertisement. Now you may use one of the ones from Moodle, or you may find your own, that's fine, but you need to include and put it in as an appendix, because that position is what you develop your cover letter in response to. It's also what you select two key selection criteria from that you submit. Your CV, you certainly use the CV that you have, but don't have things that aren't relevant for that job. So cut and paste, or pick things that are, relevant for that job. So it shouldn't be too long. It should be fairly brief. So that's where this is going, and I just want you to keep this in mind as I kind of unpack some of the other approaches, like the STAR approach, for example, because I would suggest that it's a good thing to use that when you put forward your response to selection criteria. I would suggest that it's helpful in positioning statements as well. I would suggest that it might be quite helpful in a cover letter. So when you write your positioning statement, keep in mind, and we spoke about the Australian standards for teachers, which are the AITSL standards, use that language as doesn't mean that you identify exactly which indicator, but use that to, frame your responses, because that is the standard. That's what teachers should do. That's what you're actually being assessed on. And when schools are hiring people, they have those standards in mind. It's what you get registered as with VIT. It's in relation to the same standards as well. So use that as your base, really, for all your responses. Use that language in your positioning statement when you're articulating your teaching philosophy and when you respond to key selection criteria. Use that as a guide when you're generating your portfolio, so that you're constantly connecting. So you at least thinking, okay, if this evidence, I'm putting this forward, how does it fit with the EITSL standards? And the EITSL standards obviously have a look at what the graduate descriptors are for each of the standards, but it is know students and how they learn, know the content and how to teach it, plan for and implement effective teaching and learning, create and maintain supportive and safe learning environments, assess, provide feedback and report on student learning, engage in professional learning, engage professional with colleagues, parents, carers and the community. Now, you wouldn't cover all of these all the time, but pick the ones that are a good match. Don't spread yourself too thin, but actually find examples that really generate and connect with these standards and have it clear in your mind of how you're actually meeting this. Not sure why that, okay. It's not a matter of just ticking a box. You need to consider the fact that, in fact, I'd like you to take some time to jot down this in your own thinking. Does addressing the EITSL standards actually enable you to be a better teacher? And if so, how? Also, does being a good educational practitioner better equip you to address the standards? It's a bit like the chicken or the egg, but just have a moment to think about it. Jot down your thoughts. You can pause this and just consider it. Use this as a reflection opportunity. Now I'm going to share with you an example of an advertisement. This is, as I said, one that I've used in the past, so I haven't put this up. But the selection criteria for this one was as follows, and I've actually just copied and pasted from an advertisement from a few years ago. Approval to teach kindergarten, or in Victoria that's foundation, to year 6. Strong interpersonal skills with the ability to lead and manage change, demonstrated experience or ability to articulate whole school technology planning to further develop teaching and learning, ability to lead professional learning, teacher professional learning to enhance student learning outcomes. So possibly this is not a graduate position, but nevertheless it's a teaching job. Capacity to implement strategic planning and develop programs that support students with special needs. And all this was developed for St Andrews Public School that had 800 students, 37 Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander students and 40% from a language background other than English. Opportunity class and 5 support classes. You can read that in your own time. Now, as you deconstruct this, I actually want you to look at that selection criteria. And as I said before, the first thing you need to do is to deconstruct it. What are they actually asking? So take a moment, jot down some of the key words. I'm going to share some with you shortly, just as a suggestion. But think about, okay, how would you be able to put forward an argument that you have these skills? Also, how would you actually break these up as various selection criteria, and which two would you choose to focus on for your assignment, for example? So here's an example of some keywords that I've highlighted. It's not that clear though in my highlighting here, but interpersonal skills, for example, lead and manage change. What does that actually entail? What are your interpersonal skills? What does interpersonal even mean? Are intrapersonal skills important there as well? Intra being you, inter being you, how you connect with others. Talks about demonstrated experience. I haven't highlighted demonstrated, but I probably should. It means that you will actually put forward some evidence of what you've done, that you've proven that you've got experience or ability to articulate whole school technology planning, because that's obviously a priority that they've got. So how have you gone about it? What would you do in this context? Also, ability to lead teacher professional learning to enhance student learning outcomes. So again, what would you do? How would that fit in? How would you be able to actually explore that and examine that and generate evidence around it? And what kind of ability have you got in that respect? Also, students with special needs is another important thing. Okay. I mentioned that we would talk about the STAR approach. Now, you might have come across this before. This is a really helpful approach, partly when you write your responses, whether they're for an assignment or whether it's you going for a job. In fact, I once applied for a job not being aware of the STAR approach, and I just put forward my responses, and then when I didn't get an interview, I phoned up and said, well, how come? Because I was highly qualified, or very much qualified for the job I was applying for, and that was the response I was given. Oh, you didn't use the STAR approach. Okay, so it's out there and it's used. So what it actually means, it stands for situation. So you giving, it's actually a way to kind of hang up. You're not just giving a generic example, but providing a specific, rich and kind of data contextualized example. So you will explain the situation, you will explain the task, what it was that you had to do, and what you did, what was your action, and what was the response or the outcome. Those are the 4 things that you're putting forward in a STAR answer. And you don't write oodles and noodles, but you're making sure that your answer actually touches on these. It's the same thing when you're going for an interview. If you try to actually use that in your responses and weave it in, let it become a habit, you're being a lot more specific, which is very helpful. So I've got an example here of what you would hang it up on. This is not a teaching answer, but obviously you could apply it and amend it and adapt it. This is taken from Monash, but the situation here would be that you briefly describe the situation as seen. It might be, I was working in a large retail hardware store as a customer service assistant. It's not War and Peace, it's not a long answer, but it's there. We know the context. Task, you explain what needed to be done to address the situation. So that would be, again, some of the priorities. That would be a very good fit with the selection criteria, where you're putting forward how you've had this ability, for example. So say what needed to be done to address the situation and what your role and your responsibilities were. And actually use some strong verbs there, meaning that you're specific in what you do. So our shift team had the worst safety record in the store and we needed to improve it. Okay, that was the task. Now then comes the action, what you did and how you did it. That's really where the strong verbs actually come in. And the reasons, if they are useful. I volunteered to be the safety representative. So it's not just I was involved in. You know what happened. You volunteered, so you've shown that you stepped up to the mark and you volunteered to be something specific, to be the safety representative. And I used my science studies background to explain to people good safety practices and why they're important. I arranged, so not just I was involved or I attended a meeting. You arranged for safety to be a regular item on the agenda of staff meetings. I worked with my team on posters, so specific things you did. You might even say I led the design team on posters or whatever it is, which were placed in common staff areas to raise awareness. Really, you know what happened there. And then we're looking at the result as that came of this. People became more aware of safety, so you might actually explain how. How would you know that from staff, from conversations or whatever? Compliance improved, so there's been some measurable income there. And the number of incidents dropped, again, a measurement outcome. Management noticed and gave us an award to acknowledge our improvement. Sometimes we find it difficult to say, oh, I was really good at this and this is what I did. So you might say, if you're talking about something you've done during placements, you might say, my peer teachers have commented on how this really helped the learning, or you might look at the results again that students have generated, or you might say that parents approached me to volunteer for something. So all those are kind of indicators that you're doing a good job, even if you don't want to say so yourself. You might say other people noticed, and say who those people are and what they did. Or I was congratulated by my mentor teacher on this, or whatever it is. So you've got a generic response there, but one that you can easily adapt and use as your plan of attack when you go for this. And it's actually very helpful. When we're looking at interview questions, and again, you can use the STAR approach. In fact, I would encourage you to pick one or two of those. These are not going to be questions that you would see in a key selection criteria, but it is something that you will probably be asked when you're registering for your interview, and certainly when you're going for a job. These might be some questions. How do you manage difficult behavior in the classroom? Think of an example. Actually, for each and every one of these, jot down, what have you done? What's going to be your evidence? So it doesn't just become a generic big answer, something specific, and try to use the STAR approach. How do you cater for different student abilities and learning styles? That may well be something that's part of a key selection criteria. It's just that it won't be worded as a short question like that. How have you used technology in the classroom? I think that was in fact one of the things in that St Andrews ad you just saw. What are your teaching strengths and how do you use them in the classroom? Really important. Fits in with the 8 standard. In fact, all of these probably do. In the school, where do you go if you need to? And it could be anything from whatever. What curriculum and or school documents do you use to inform your planning? List the types of assessment you use and how does your teaching link to assessment? Is the assessment authentic? What strategies do you use to manage the classroom? And that's not just behaviour management, but actually how you set it up for learning. Again, think of things like visible learning, teaching standards to articulate how you do this. What extracurricular activities have you been involved with? I was asked once going for a job at an independent school in Sydney if I would be prepared to coach the football team. Now, being Swedish, I don't even know what Australian football involves, but yep, sure, willing to learn. So, thinking about it. How do you plan units and lessons? What do you go about it? What do you do? How do you go about it? And again, looking at how does that then impact learning? Provide examples. These might be things you might use in your portfolio, possibly. But I would suggest that the portfolio exemplars, artifacts that you put forward for your assessment, connect them with the key selection criteria, because then you have something to hang it up on. And you may well come across similar key selection criteria when you go for a job, in which case you've got some pre-prepared things, which is handy. When you go for an interview, rehearse. There's some questions that are you will be asked, definitely. Tell us a bit about yourself and why you're applying for this job. You will be asked that. That's going to be a lead in all likelihood. And what they're really trying to find out is, who is this person? Can we work with them? If it's a small setting, it's a good idea to connect things like your interpersonal skills and how you work well with colleagues. Incidentally, a very similar question, surprise, surprise, that was posed to me when I applied for this job. So you need to share, who are you? How will you work in this setting? Why are you a good person for this job? Include, you're not going to regurgitate everything that you've put in your CV, but you might connect with something, particularly if it's something you haven't necessarily touched on. But the reasons why you're applying for this. Why are you keen to get this job? Not just, I want a paying job, why? Why is this school a good school for you? At the end of the interview, they will ask you, is there anything else you'd like to add? And rather than going, no, not really, take that as an opportunity to actually highlight anything that hasn't come up in the interview that you're good at. You want to sell yourself again. And they also, from a panel's point of view, they want to protect themselves to make sure that they've given you a fair go at dazzling them. So highlight something that's positive about yourself that's obviously applicable to the job you're going for that you haven't talked about. Just be careful because you don't want to regurgitate everything again. Have a good little exit line that you can finish off on. So think about it and practice. Have practices with a friend. You can even, what I've actually done is I've generated little flip cards with common interview questions, and I'd put them upside down so I didn't know which was coming, and then I just actually put my camera on the computer and just took them out one by one and practiced responses. And a lot of the time they're pretty similar questions that keep popping up, so have a look what's up there. Often when you respond, and this is again kind of an interview question, so it's really the next step, but I'm sharing it with you anyway. I think, or I believe, are pretty good lead-ins because they flag that you're a thinker, that you have a sound base for your action. You might preface that before you then go into your STAR approach. I have, what you've done, how you handle things. I will, while you're there, you know, if I'm your new, if I'm, should I get this position, I will be doing this. I'll be working at making connections with parents in respect to whatever it is that they're doing. So yeah, some similar things. Another way of also, if you get a bit flummoxed with a question, to get some thinking time is to kind of repeat the question. If they're saying, how do you, actually let me go back to one of these, how do you manage difficult behaviour in the classroom? Is to actually kind of start with a full sentence. I manage difficult behaviour in the classroom by doing blah, 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 because by the time you've said those words, your brain kind of kicks in before you answer. So it helps, or as you answer, I should say, it helps you sound more on the ball. You might use your fingers to remember, particularly if they're double-barreled questions. You just know, okay, there are 3 things I'm going to address, or there are a few key facts that I need to address in this question. So listen very carefully and don't start formulating your answer until you've heard the whole question. Think of the 5 constituents that really are key stakeholders in education. So students, obviously, Department of Education, staff, peers, parents, so peers as in your colleagues, and parents, and make sure you're catering for them in your answers. When you're interviewed, think before you answer, take your time, and then you can use that technique I just said about kind of constructing a full sentence, which gives you some thinking time. Ask if you're unsure. If you're not sure what they mean, ask them to clarify it. Be precise. Don't generalize. That's where that STAR approach is so effective, because it makes you specific and you're providing actual examples, which is why it's good if you're looking at the 8 SIL standard to actually go through them and identify for each and every one or 2 things that you've done. So you've got specific examples for each and every one of those. You're just coming in with confidence. You know already what you're going to be putting forward. It's not going to be a surprise because you know what the standards are. Doesn't mean that you know them necessarily off by heart, but you've got, for each and every one that comes up, you've got something to refer to, something specific. Look at all the panel members, even if they're not looking at you. It's okay to repeat what's in your written application, but make sure that you're actually saying the same thing, so you're not contradicting yourself. Don't big note yourself necessarily or pretend that you're something you're not. You might have someone who's nodding furiously, you might ignore that person. Occasionally you have people who are really kind of there to look at your body language, which might be a bit concerning at times, but anyway. Answer the question and then stop. Don't waffle. Another thing, if you don't know, say so. If you don't understand, ask questions. Because you're showing that you're active, you're not some sort of wallflower, you're there, it's a way of connecting with people as well. Be prepared to be placed under stress and react to it. Everyone actually understands that you're going to be a bit nervous if you're going for an interview. Make notes. There might be things that you want to draw on that you, having looked at the ad. Actually, one of the things I should say if you are called for an interview. No, actually, before you, even when you just apply for a job, there's always a contact number there. Ring them, ring the person and ask questions. Come up with some questions that are relevant for the job, because even that shows that you're keen for a job. It makes you stand out from all the people who don't phone. And it's actually a good way of making sure that you're in that shortlist that will be interviewed eventually. If you're not successful in getting the job, ask for feedback and make use of that. And good luck. Now, I've got a little video clip here from the Armstrong and Miller show, which is, it's a bit corny, but it's quite funny. So you can have a look at that. Click on the hyperlink, and it's a bit tongue-in-cheek when it comes to job interviews. That's it. I know that you're not being interviewed for this subject, but nevertheless, I think it's quite helpful. Definitely use the STAR approach as you're constructing your answers. Not like I'm going to sit and go STAR when I'm marking your papers, but it just gives you a more focused way of answering questions. So again, have a look at the rubric if you're not sure. And that's pretty much it for today. Next week, we're looking at continuing the look, action, look, act, think steps, where you're going to be reflecting and implement solutions. So I'm not necessarily going to talk all that much more. It will just be a continuation of the action research, and I would suggest that you concentrate probably on your blogs and your collaboration with that. Okay, thank you.